Welcome, everyone. This is the second of our Facebook Live audio rooms. I am extremely excited for our guest today. Last time around, we talked about the future of home automation with the hookup and Snazzy Labs. That was a ton of fun. And today, our topic is Linux. Then, now, and the future. And my guest today is the one and only Wendell Wilson from Level 1 Techs. I'm extremely glad that he's here to join me because it is an incredible time for Linux. If you guys are familiar with Linux, I'm not going to be telling you anything that you don't know, except maybe that actually it's not Linux. What you were referring to is in fact new plus Linux. Okay, sorry. I'm not gonna do that right now.
No.
No way, Wendell. There you are. Um, but what's really exciting about Linux right now is that if you're not familiar with Linux, Linux has traditionally been in the server space mainstream for many years, but in the consumer space has been at best a niche operating system. But we are on the cusp of a moment where I believe all of that is about to change. Wendell, why don't you introduce yourself? Maybe you can do it better than I can. What exactly is it that you'd say you do here?
I'm a computer janitor. I get to actually work on a lot of these systems, and I sort of came up with Linux. You know, in the beginning, very when I was a student, I sort of caused problems because I was using Linux, and that was sort of the forbidden operating system. It was like, no, we only have IBM sanctioned solutions. So I've got kind of a history with Linux. But I'm with Level 1 Text. You can check that out. Level the number one text, .com. I like Linux. I've done all kinds of Linux or open source stuff, but I see Linux as like a bigger piece of things that are open because that's better for humanity. And that ties in with things like right to repair. And that ties in with not being locked into one particular vendor. It's open source. If you don't like something, you can change it. And that's why every different flavor of the Linux has so many different things, is because somebody has done something crazy.
Coincidentally, Tux is about to turn 30, or excuse me, just turned 30. What is the
It,
actual date here?
it was the email from Linus Torvalds. You know, we're doing this thing, and it's like Linux then and now, and I was like, no, you got the wrong Linus. Oh no, no, I'm just kidding. But it was on Wednesday. It was the 30th anniversary of the email from student Linus Torvalds to the mailing list, a Unix mailing list that was like, I've got this project. It's probably not going to amount to anything. It's just a hobby. I just really wanted to be able to run Linux on my inexpensive 386 computer, because that was kind of unheard of at the time. It was on the really expensive university systems. And there was this thing called Minix, but he didn't really like Minix. So it was like, okay, this is probably not going to be anything. And it was the 30th birthday of that on Wednesday.
So, what was the intention from the get-go? It was to have an alternative to closed systems that you could run on inexpensive hardware?
It was really not so much that. I think that was part of it, but it was, I want something that has the horsepower and uh, flexibility of use as a commercial Unix. But companies like AT&T had really sort of captured the Unix market, and Digital Electronics Corporation. And so Unix was found everywhere in like airline reservation systems, and it was really running business in America. And Linus Torvalds saw that and was like, I would really like to have something like that as a desktop operating system because it's so powerful.
So when you talk about powerful, I think the way most consumers think of powerful, they think in terms of megahertz or how many FPS they can run. But from a software standpoint, that's not really what powerful means, because you could run Windows, or you could run Linux, or you could run Mac OS on the same piece of hardware, and well, Mac OS with a little bit of fighting with it anyway, on the same piece of hardware, and it would be able to perform, in most cases, very similarly in the same task, whether that's running a game or compiling code. So what do you mean by more powerful software?
In the modern vernacular, so like computer science is really awesome because the story really begins in the 1970s. In the beginning, it was possible for one person to understand all of computer science, And over the last, lifetime of Linux, 30 years, computer science has exploded, and we have all this different fun machine learning and all kinds of stuff, and all of that's driven by software. Power to Linus Torvalds was the ability to string together a bunch of very simple programs in order to be able to come up with a really, really complicated behavior. And other desktop operating systems, things like DOS was around, Linus Torvalds had experience with the disk operating system, and it's like, okay, this is kind of a toy operating system. I can only do the basic stuff for file management. I couldn't write a program to say, take an input from a line printer and then turn that back into a file really easily without hauling out, programming software, when really I should be able to script that together at like a shell level. And so the power is really the flexibility that comes from having 1,000,001 little system libraries that you could string together to invent and be creative without necessarily, you're going to be a programmer, but you don't necessarily want to haul out the programming tools every time you want to do stuff, because then maintaining that isn't very much fun and blah, blah, blah. So the power is really that flexibility to do whatever you want. And that's
So it's
true
more
on
like
the Mac side.
empowerment.
Yeah, exactly.
We've got a great example from a time that we worked together. Actually, I was about to say not that long ago, but I guess it was actually kind of a hot minute ago. We were rolling out a server that used a vast array of NVMe drives. So these are extremely high-speed drives. They're hooked up directly on the PCI Express bus. And we ran into a problem with them where every time the drives would behave normally just on their own. But every time we took that whole super fast array and we tried to write or read any data to it, it just started spitting out these errors, and it started kind of hiccuping and hitching. And on Windows, there was absolutely nothing that we could do to fix this behavior. We're stuck with whatever kernel level interaction between the hardware ships with Windows. We're stuck with whatever driver Intel deems we are worthy of, that whatever they provide us. And so there was no way for us to fix this behavior. But why don't you talk through kind of what you were able to do with the freedom Linux provides to fix that problem?
Yeah, so Linux really gave us two things that Windows didn't, and that was, one, the ability to really like dissect the operating system and understand where and how the failure was occurring, or at least to narrow it down. And so we could see that, the drives would time out. It was like they weren't responding, but then we could check the buffer on the drive and see, oh no, the data is actually there. So we could make little tweaks to the system and then sort of correct the issue or work around the issue. And it's like, okay, this is kind of a hardware bug. We don't have access to the Intel firmware to change this, or we don't have access to the system, the board level firmware, wherever the issue was, to fix the issue. But we can sort of work around it in software, because we can see that the drive works in this one mode, but maybe not this other mode. And so we end up tweaking the kernel, doing a recompile. Oh yeah, we rebooted a whole lot. But, doing something like that on a closed operating system, you can't really think of that. That was one of the things, like the Digital Electronics Corporation, they have the PDP-11, and that was one of the reasons that system was so popular, is because it was so open at a hardware and software level. Now, they controlled it. You still had to pay them, but you could integrate that with your flight system, or integrate that with literally anything, and it would totally work. The first really big project that I did with Linux was at a time when Linux would do IP masquerading. And so it was the school's computer system. So you can imagine how dicey this was, letting a student, a high school student, work on this kind of thing. But we have Ethernet computers, but our internet connection comes in on a token ring type network, which is a competing standard for Ethernet. And the school couldn't afford to buy the bridge to do Ethernet and token ring. So another student and I were like, wait, we could do this with Linux. And so we scripted it together and we put it together. And at the time it was called IP masquerading. And so, like, the technical people in the school system, it was like we were, black hat, hackers, lock us up, don't let us make phone calls kind of things, because it's like, this shouldn't be possible. And if this is possible, you guys are definitely pirating software in order to do this, because nobody would give this away for free. IBM wanted 10 grand for a box to do this. And it's like, no, we understood, we saw in our minds what we wanted, and we constructed it without really having to do any programming. And that's the power.
And now you mentioned that. You mentioned really one of the key foundational pieces of Linux and really the OSS, the open source software movement, and that's that Linux is free. So, you know, how did that come to be?
It's it's sort of a fun story. The GNU utilities sort of predated, like as your intro joke sort of alluded to. There were the GNU utilities, and so the Free Software Foundation was working on free equivalents of a lot of the stuff that was in Unix. One of my favorites was a little bit of a joke. If you have a text file that won't fit on screen, so like you're looking, at a document, you can scroll, but that was kind of a big feature, in the 80s and into the 90s. And so there was a command line program that would page through a text file that was longer than would fit on screen, and it was called more. And so you would do more space file name, and it would give you one page at a time. Well, the
Yeah.
GNU version of that was called less, because less is more. And there's also GNU, file editors. There's Emacs and VI and this kind of thing. And so Linus Torvalds comes along and he's like, okay, I need a kernel. These utilities are great. These GNU utilities are great, but they're working on an operating system that would eventually become the herd, and that wasn't ready yet. And that the GNU utilities were very long in the making, dating to the 80s. So Linus Torvalds comes along and says, okay, I'll have a kernel, or I'll put the kernel together. I'll just use the GNU utilities for now. And that's why Richard Stallman, sometimes he's the guy that's like, what you're referring to as Linux is GNU/Linux. And so he was kind of, it's like, you're stealing our thunder a little bit, but
Right.
it's open source. Like you get to do that. The license also empowers some of the functionality here, because it's Steve Ballmer at Microsoft famously said it was a viral license, because if you take it and you do something with it, you also have to open source the stuff that you did if you distribute it. If you take Linux and modify it, like the stuff that we did to fix your stuff, we don't have to open source it. There's a forum thread that has what I did, but we don't have to open source it because we're not distributing it. But if I make my little kernel module that's like fix NVMe performance, .ko for kernel module, I have to also release the source for that, because somebody else could take it and modify it because of the way that the code was licensed to me in the first place for me to do that
really
work.
Then it wasn't Linus Torvalds who ultimately made the decision that Linux, the operating system as we know it now, should be free. It was the very fact that he was leaning on other open source software that necessitated his license to follow that license and be free to use and free to distribute.
Yeah, it was definitely the thing that made the most sense to do. I mean, he could have done it a different way, but it would have been with more friction. And because he did it that way, and because it has a little bit of this viral component, is I think one of the reasons that it's been so successful. But it's a double-edged sword. I mean, a lot of the work that like Netflix is doing around open source, they've kind of shied away from the Linux side of it in favor of BSD licenses, which don't require them to release anything. And the same is also true of Apple. Apple, the Apple printing subsystem, Cups, is licensed the same way, and Apple has very famously not been a great steward for the printing interface stuff, or even the command interpreter, the Bash shell for command interpreter stuff, because Apple has some modifications to that, but they won't really stop using a hideously old version of Bash, and some of these things have been corrected in recent years or have improved, but Apple really wants to build on that and not sort of release the special sauce or release the things that they modified. Like they're content to fix Cups to make it work for their stuff, but then they don't want to really release the source code, and they haven't really, without really getting into it, they haven't been the best at that kind of thing. So companies are still weird about it.
Now, you talk about the virality of Linux in terms of like that it is self-replicating, because anytime you add anything to it, you are contributing, you are improving it, and you are therefore obligated, if you want to distribute that, to make those improvements free to anyone. And so it has kind of like a virus, it kind of evolves, because anything that's garbage will presumably eventually be pruned or outcompeted, if we want to use more of like an evolutionary term, outcompeted by something else. And you talk about this in terms of success, how successful Linux has been as a competitive entity in the software space. But I think when we're discussing the success of Linux, we could say it's successful in terms of the empowerment, like that original goal of having something that is powerful enough in terms of being able to do whatever you want with it. You know, like on Linux, for example, there is no way that well, one of the funny things about Linux is that when you watch Netflix on a Linux machine, you're limited to 720p because Microsoft basically got in bed with content streaming platforms like Netflix and includes DRM in their operating system that will handshake with those platforms to enable them to play back at higher resolutions that are more conducive to creating high quality video captures, except theoretically you can't do it because of this DRM that's embedded in it. On Linux, that kind of thing won't fly because this is an operating system that if you know your way around it, you would easily be able to disable and deploy countermeasures for that kind of thing. So, okay, it's been successful in terms of empowerment, but let's talk about one of the big thorns in the side of the Linux community. What about success in terms of inclusion? How do we make Linux accessible?
There's that it's a landmine, and I've lost my leg. I probably won't bleed out if I use my belt on my stump here real quick, but it is a little bit of a double-edged sword because you can do literally anything. There are a lot of very strong-willed people that have ideas about what the interface should be, and as you get really deep into using Linux, it will change you. Like your expectation of what a user interface should be will absolutely change you. For Netflix specifically, you can do some stuff like deals have been made, and some of the deals aren't really public. And depending on what browser you're using, you can actually get Widevine DRM protected stuff now, which is sort of weird. The least non-public thing that's happened is the Fedora people licensed from Cisco H.264 decoding, because there's this kerfuffle around, is H.264 a really popular compression standard? Probably. All YouTube uses H.264 and VP9 and a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
But it's a really super popular codec, and it may be encumbered by software patents. And so it's kind of a gray area. It's like, okay, it's open source, but do you have the right to use that intellectual property even though you have a license to the software? Because those are different things under the law. And so Fedora has gone so far as to actually license from Cisco the right for their users to be able to use H.264 decoding. And similar deals have been made in some browsers. To a certain extent, I think Mozilla and Google with Chrome, and maybe you could also make the argument for Chromium, should try to, sort of deal with those things, because ultimately those things become security through obscurity things. And that's one set of problems. The other set of problems are agreeing on what the user interface should be, or maybe just having somebody that has a really killer vision for what that interface should be. At least right now, Android is really just a very fancy front end for the Linux kernel and the command line stuff. And the same is true with Chrome OS. And I don't know why from the beginning Chrome OS and Android weren't really the same thing. I mean, Apple is really lapping everybody here with that because they've got iOS, which basically runs on everything now, including being able to run iOS apps reasonably well on laptops.
Yeah.
Google should have been there 10 years ago with their architecture, and they're not. And I don't really have a good explanation for why that is. But I think that if we have somebody like Linus Torvalds that appears and is charismatic and has the force of will to build us an interface, or conversely, a billion-trillion-dollar company like Google or whoever builds something like Android for the desktop experience, but that is also open, that it may solve a lot of those problems. But having 47 million different ways to do things does get you into trouble, because ultimately you end up having to learn how it's actually put together. And a lot of users don't actually want that.
No, that's 100% true. I mean, I was actually kind of expecting you to counter my point and say Linux is the most mainstream thing ever because you're using it right now. It's on your phone. It's probably running in an embedded form on a variety of devices that are within, 10 meters of you at any given moment. Like Linux is everywhere. But, I was kind of expecting you to push back on me, or push back against me on that one. But I think you understood what I meant. And I'm talking about Linux as a desktop operating system that I would actually willingly install on my computer and use day to day, because like you said, it changes you. There's little quality of life things about Linux that I think would blow the minds of the average computer user. Like, for example, you know how Windows 11 finally has better management of the multi-desktop feature? So
Oh
you can
yeah,
have all these, yeah, all these different layouts. And I forget what it is exactly that they've tweaked going from Windows 10 to Windows 11, but it's like better. The first time I saw multi-desktop was back in the Windows XP days, and it was on like Ubuntu or something. And it
yeah,
had this really cool animated cube that like turned. It blew my freaking mind. And I was like, wait, that's Linux? And then
yeah,
there's another great one. Then another
yeah.
great one. Oh man, Wendell, how much does it drive you crazy when you go to uninstall a program on Windows?
Oh
Okay,
my God. Oh,
you
it's
can
just such.
only uninstall one at a time. It
Oh,
takes forever because it has to go dig every stupid little DLL or registry file or whatever crap it created when it was first installed. And then you're stuck sitting there. If you have to, God forbid, you have to uninstall an RGB utility or something like that. Why don't you
it's
tell people how easy it is to install and uninstall programs in batches on Linux?
so the magic vernacular that has come about from Linux is called package management. This idea of managing the software packages that are on your machine. So Microsoft does have some kind of package management, and I have to call this out because it is such a Lovecraftian horror on Windows. It's the Windows side-by-side system. If you have any developers in the audience that have had to deal with multiple versions of .NET, there's this labyrinthine thing inside the Windows System 32 folder where it manages all the different versions of the .NET libraries, and it's very opaque, and it's a huge pain in the butt, and it is truly wrought from the depths of something terrible. On Linux, package management can approach that same level of difficulty, which is why we have things like Flatpak and Snap and some other things to address different versioning, but it's not nearly as bad. And the package management system on Linux usually goes with your distro. So like a Fedora and Red Hat derived distros have a package management utility. Debian and Ubuntu and related distros have the same package management, and so on. And so Arch does it a different way. Arch and Manjaro and those. And the package manager is responsible for keeping your system clean and tidy. And it
Yeah.
really does an incredible job because Linux being the way that it is, everybody is super obsessed with keeping everything organized. It just won't
Right.
fly if you package a program that makes a mess all over your system. Like the system administrators don't like that. Whereas a commercial software company, they can just be like, let's just, sort of throw something together. And it doesn't matter
Yeah.
if the files end up scattered across your hard drive. And so 30 years of that, this is where we are. Windows 11 actually adds something called WinGit. And you can install this on Windows 10 if you install the App Store. And WinGit is an approach for package management on Windows, finally. And you just run one command. You can do it through the GUI. You can point and click, and it'll install an application and all of the dependencies and everything that you need and make it to where you just have to run it, and you're good. And you don't have to think about it. And the interface is standardized across all programs. A program is not responsible for writing its installer GUI, which is the fundamental philosophical difference there.
So the funniest things to me about the way that you install applications and uninstall applications on Linux is that they were basically 10 years ahead of the curve, at least 10 years ahead of the curve, because in a way, a Linux repository was basically the Apple App Store. Like
Yeah,
fundamentally, it works in exactly the same way, where when you install an application, it's all this nice self-contained little thing. It's one click, and when you're done with it, it's one click to get rid of it, and the whole thing is completely gone. And it also blows me away that, Linux, well, it doesn't blow me away because Linux has a hard time marketing itself. So the fact that Linux wasn't able to package this up as neatly as Apple can and market it as a really, really important feature doesn't surprise me. But what does surprise me was that Microsoft allowed the traditional installer to stay around for so long, because even aside from the user inconvenience of having to click through a whole bunch of prompts, the whole wizard concept is so outdated at this point. Even aside from that, it is such a security nightmare. The amount of malware that gets installed on computers from users just carelessly clicking through, offers for adware and spyware and garbage that are embedded in these installer wizards it's mind-blowing. Like, how many billions of dollars would have been wiped out of the computer security industry if we had done away with the installer 20 years ago, when we probably should have and could have, and just gone with a package style program installer?
If only the Ubuntu servers were charging developers 20%, they would have been way more successful. It's like, no, we're providing the package. We need 30%. I'm sorry, 30%. That's why the Apple Store was successful, is because they're charging money, and it's like, oh, there's money to be made here. That's a thing. There are occasionally instances where malware does make it through, but usually you have tiers. So like you have a like the canonical tier for Ubuntu, and so it's like these are officially tested and supported, and then you have like a lower tier where it's like the people that we trust have done these, and then you have an even lower tier that's like, this is community, and you can kind of DIY this and add this, and so there is kind of a trust aspect there. On Windows, like you've got adware where maybe getting the program for free is the thing, like that they get to advertise to you is the thing that actually happens. Like I've got the Epic Games thing, and I get a pop up in the corner, every other day, and it's like, oh, it's free, but they're advertising to me, and it's not a lot of fun to try to deal with that. So yeah, security would definitely be a lot better. It would be a lot easier to audit things. It's like, I would like to, I've got one computer and I've got another computer on Linux. It's real easy. It's like, here's a list of installed packages, and then I can import that list of packages into the new machine, and it'll find them and tell me, it's like, hey, this package isn't available anymore, or this version the author has said is not compatible with the old version. It's an upfront thing. I know it immediately. On Windows, it's just like, you're on your own, and it's like, well, I was using this older version of Office. Am I going to have any problems? And it's like, oh.
Yeah. Ironically, I mean, one of the reasons people use Windows is because it just works. But especially now that we're headed into this Windows 10 was a really interesting era as a Windows user, because it was the first time that, oh man, I guess the last time I remember this happening would have had to be the XP days. So it's the first time in a long time that just running the correct version of Windows didn't necessarily mean that a piece of software was going to run properly, or even that it was going to install at all. I mean, I would run into downloading the latest graphics drivers from NVIDIA, and it would simply say, hey, look, you are not patched up recently enough. You cannot install this graphics driver. This is too old a version of Windows 10. So even though, I mean, we had that concept of Windows 10 being the last Windows and just being kind of an evolving operating system, if anything, I think that actually made things even less it just works. And I would personally appreciate that kind of upfrontness about compatibility. And actually, speaking of Windows and things not just working, Microsoft just backtracked on their intention to not allow certain older systems to easily install Windows 11. Now, that's something you want to talk about powerful. Let's talk about not very powerful computers. That's something Linux handles much better than Windows, would you say?
Yeah, you can make a lot of choices to shed a lot of the cruft for older machines. So, I mean, even there are specialty distros that will give you a modern web browser. The web browser is really the most difficult thing to run on older hardware. But if you need a machine for word processing and very light web browsing and everything else, anything of the last 15, almost 20 years is fine. And you can pick certain Linux distros that are specialty for older hardware, and it works really well. So like if you want to set up a bunch of machines for your church or a school that's poor or outreach program or whatever, you can basically use garbage computers that are otherwise unsupportable with a modern version of Linux and a modern graphical environment and be able to do pretty much anything. And you can still have a pretty reasonable web experience if you limit yourself to 2 or 3 tabs and you try to keep the memory usage to a minimum, because web pages have gotten so complicated that's like the quote unquote big application now, which is crazy. We always joke about Chrome tabs needing 32 gigs of memory. There's a reason.
That's such a great thing to bring up. I mean, the power to run it on whatever hardware you want. I mean, I ran into something recently. My grandparents have one of the old white iMacs, the one with the giant chin, not the Pixar lamp character one, the one after that.
Sandy Bridge or Ivy Bridge based.
Yeah, it's Core 2 Duo actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's an older one, and basically they started getting this message that, hey, Firefox is no longer going to be supported, and I had to dig around. I had to find this Arctic Fox fork of Firefox or something that was still going to provide a secure browsing experience for them, and it was kind of frustrating for me because they don't need a new computer, but here they were, if they didn't have a tech savvy grandson, basically going to follow the prompts that their operating system and their applications were throwing at them, telling them it's time to consume. It's time to buy something new. It doesn't matter that this was going to do exactly what you needed it to do. You need to buy something. And I just think that's extremely consumer unfriendly. And I don't know why we accept it.
I think that it's really interesting you bring that up because I think for our topic, it is kind of related to the future of Linux. And if you think of Linux as it's completely, like you were saying, it's completely taken over the universe, basically everywhere except the desktop. And it is really, it's forced out a lot of stuff, like how it used to be with servers, how it used to be with networking gear, how it used to be with a lot of stuff. I mean, to be sure, there's still room at the high end for networking gear, but for what most people need, no. And there is a way that Linux is kind of going to force that out here too, because at the end of the day, if you have a computer that's just a display and a keyboard and a mouse, and the display is reasonable, the picture quality is good, and you don't want to upgrade anything like that. If you could remotely use a machine really efficiently, then it doesn't really matter where you are for running those kind of things. And so that's a kind of containerization. And so one of the ways that Linux might break into the desktop overnight is if Linux has a really robust way to containerize some of those old experiences. So the computer that you speak of, the ancient Mac, if we can take that, put it in a little container, and run it in the cloud on something that costs $5 a month because that's the amount of compute that it requires, then you can keep using the same keyboard, mouse, monitor interface, and then the security issues go away. The do you have enough horsepower for your browser thing goes away, and the cost ends up being practically nothing, based on whatever their usage of the computer is. And Linux really, really empowers those kind of containerized experiences with virtual machines and lightweight containers and everything else. And Microsoft knows that. And that's why they've added the Windows subsystem for Linux, which lets you run Linux stuff under Windows to give developers and people tools to do that kind of containerization.
So why don't you tell me, like, why would I guess I know the answer. So the reason my grandparents would do something like that, essentially turning their old iMac into a thin client, is that it would clean up the security, because unless there was like a deep OS level security flaw, I mean, we're talking on the order of like, man, what was that? What was that horrific Windows XP one where if you so much blaster, where if you so much as plugged an Ethernet cable into the internet, you would be like instantly infected with it. Like,
Yep.
unless something that egregious occurred, you could have all the enjoyment of a modern secure computing experience, but using your old hardware essentially just as like a thin client then.
Yes. And I think Microsoft kind of said the quiet part out loud with that, with the whole, we're going to
Windows
deprecate a bunch of old.
365.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it was like, oh, if you got an old computer, don't upgrade. Keep running Windows 10. We're going to support that forever. But also sign up for this free trial of the desktop in the cloud. And it's like, okay, that's kind of slimy.
Well, yeah, Microsoft's got to make money.
But the good news is
So,
running Linux in the cloud is an order of magnitude less expensive. I mean, the smallest Amazon instance you can get is on the order of like $5 a month, and it would be very easy to run a profitable business that turned that iMac into an incredibly powerful experience for computation, being able to run really powerful modern applications, and still would just cost less than the $10 a month, and it would be a great experience.
so Linux is everywhere. We've beat that point to death at this point. But why don't you tell me some of the places that we might find Linux that you wouldn't expect? Just, for those of you who are tuning in right now, guys, we're talking with Wendell Wilson. He's the host of Level 1 Techs, and he has like a real job, quote unquote, that he's always really cagey about. So I'm not gonna I'm not gonna ask him to elaborate on it. But basically, he's a professional tinkerer, as far as I can tell, and he grants us these windows into what he's working on so often over on his YouTube channel. You guys can check him out. It's level one, the number one, level one techs. And I just love the name of that channel because you're anything but a level one technician. So why don't you
It's
tell us some surprising places that we might find Linux that we wouldn't expect it?
um, it's in a lot of industrial control systems, so it might show up in, you know, your municipal water district or like the power grid or anything like that. It's in a lot of
But
there
why?
are
Okay,
well,
why
but
would they run Linux? Tell me. I mean, I
it's
know the answer,
robust.
but
It's robust, and you can get 10, 20, 30 years out of it. The thing that I built, like the first thing that I ever built with Linux, where it was like I have made fire, was the experience that I was feeling internally. um, was it would still be working today, you know, routing packets from token ring to Ethernet and vice versa if left alone. You know, assume there's probably be security issues and that kind of thing, but you can count on it for that level of awesome. And the rover, the Mars rover, at this point
mhm.
is running Linux, so it's on another planet. It was the first operating system on another planet.
That's cool.
So Linux is it's, you know, satellites in orbit. It's literally everywhere except the desktop operating system, and partly because it's open source. It's like, why would you want to reinvent the wheel? We figured it out. Like the Romans figured out aqueducts. Why would we want to design new aqueducts? We have the design. Oh, Roman concrete is pretty awesome. Why would we want to try to come up with some alternative to concrete when we can just take concrete and use it?
Okay. If you wanted to, if you, not if you wanted to, I'm going to make you do it. If you had to use one word to describe why Linux hasn't cracked the mainstream for desktop computers, there's one that I have in my mind, but if you had to use one word to describe why it hasn't happened, what would it be? You can't say
Probably,
Microsoft. That's not a word. That's a proper noun.
I would say probably fragmentation.
Fragmentation. You know what? I was going to say gaming, but you go ahead and you defend your choice.
I think the fragmentation on the desktop, everybody would like a very consistent experience, and it doesn't have to be the best experience. You know, Windows was born into a world of many, 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 many competing operating systems that varied in cost and complexity. I mean, there were really incredible DOS multitasking programs like DeskView, which would let you run multiple DOS programs simultaneously. It was very efficient. If you ever watched anybody that used old DOS word processors, like WordPerfect for DOS, you learn the keyboard shortcuts and you work. In terms of like how efficient is the worker once they know how to use WordPerfect, the WordPerfect user is always more efficient than the Microsoft Word user for general day-to-day things that you need to do in a word processor. Microsoft Word didn't make you learn anything, and so you sort of lost something there. Linux is kind of, it's not exactly the same problem, but because there is a fragmentation of what the user experience is, you can learn how to do your things. But if you want to work on a competing distro or you want to work on something else, they do things a little bit different, and so you learn everything being just a little bit different here, there, and yonder. It makes you smarter. It makes you learn more stuff. It makes it
Yeah.
really awesome. But you can't really uh, you can't really do this, that, and the other with it. Frank, to your point with gaming, the thing that ties into that is probably things like office formats. There's a really great story. Microsoft was facing competition from Lotus 123. Lotus 123 for DOS was, you know, as big as Microsoft is in the 80s, and they controlled the business spreadsheet, and they were a juggernaut. They were unstoppable. The thing that made Microsoft Excel able to supplant and take over Lotus 123 after Microsoft had invested millions of dollars and didn't make any headway at all in market share was to make Microsoft Excel be able to save to Lotus 123. And the executives were freaking out. They were like, we don't want to be able to have Excel save to Lotus 123 because we're going to lose what meager market share we have. We have to do everything to lock people into Microsoft Excel. And because they enabled people to be able to move between Excel and Lotus 123 seamlessly, that's what made it take off. And it took over everywhere overnight. I mean, in 2 years, Lotus 123, nobody had ever heard of them.
Wow. See, I wasn't really around doing spreadsheet things in those days, so that's really interesting to hear about. Okay, so let's talk about from because okay, yeah, like there's the technological reasons that Linux hasn't taken off on the desktop, and I think you addressed that really well with fragmentation. I mean, if every time you got into a different brand of car, it drove slightly differently, it would make the driver's licensing program a nightmare. There would be 100-fold as many accidents on the road. Like, there's a reason that we don't force the app. No offense to anyone watching, but there's a reason that we don't force the average user to relearn how to do something every time they do it on a slightly different machine. So
Yeah.
that's, I think, the technological side of it. But I want to talk about more like the psychological, the human side of why it hasn't taken off. And this is something that I'm gonna totally change gears. You're gonna see where I'm going here, but I want to talk about McDonald's because when I was a kid, McDonald's was a family friendly restaurant. For me, going to McDonald's was all about they had whatever the hottest movie or hottest video game was, they had a series of Happy Meal toys that were going to make me come back, not just today, but every single week so I could get the whole collection. The entire restaurant was decked out in these bright, fun colors. They had bright, fun mascots like Ronald McDonald, the weird purple thing, the duck, whatever her name was. Basically, yeah, whatever, Ronald McDonald. And the music. There was like the merry-go-round music in there, like the playgrounds. And it was right around the time that I reached sort of adolescence, I guess, that McDonald's started putting McCafe into their restaurants, and everything went kind of green and brown for a bit. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
The
yeah.
the
It's like
green and brown
it's too over
phase.
the top.
They were trying to go upscale. They were trying to take on Starbucks, and I can see why. I mean, Starbucks was basically printing money at that point. But what I think McDonald's set themselves up for was a period of struggle. And I haven't actually looked at it in the last year or two. I have no idea how the pandemic has affected their fortunes one way or the other. But I know that for a while, they were starting to lull. And the reason that I believe that happened was because the greatest marketing, Grimace was apparently the name of the purple McDonald's character. The reason that McDonald's was growing so well with my generation was that they grew up alongside us. They hooked us when we were kids. And that is why I think Linux is struggling for adoption. And okay, I'm coming up because speaking from my own experience, the only reason that I know or even care how to use a computer at all is because I wanted to play video games and my parents weren't tech savvy enough to hook it up for me. That's the only reason I ever opened up the side panel of a computer to upgrade a graphics card. That was the spark that lit the fire. And that is something that I think has affected Linux more than people realize. I never got into it when I was a kid because I had no reason to learn because the games I wanted to play were not on Linux. They were on Windows. Why don't you talk about, okay, so A, do you think I'm totally off base here? And B, why did that happen? Why did games only run on Windows or, well, DOS, if we want to go back farther, for so many years?
Well, that's a really interesting observation, and not at all where I thought you were going with that. But that's fascinating. For me, the spark was um, I can learn more faster, and I can have an interface and do things. But that's what I want. If you asked me what I wanted to be in fourth grade, I literally was telling people I wanted to be a robotics engineer, which is crazy. I've sort of been doing this for a long time. I don't know, but the the lure of technology, the promise of technology, like the figuring out of secrets and things like that. So I'm probably the odd man out. I think that you're probably right. A lot of the people that are interested in those things are like, how can I do something really killer? How can I play a game? And in the beginning, uh, DOS supporting DOS games not in DOS is a hugely uphill battle. Famously, there's this story that came out of Microsoft about SimCity. There was SimCity for DOS, which was a hugely popular DOS game when Windows 95 was coming about. But Windows 95 wanted to take over the entire machine. There's not really DOS anymore with Windows 95. Can we make Windows 95 good enough to run DOS games under Windows 95? And they tried, and they were mostly successful, but there were bugs. And so there was a bug in SimCity for DOS where it would use memory that had been freed. Well, in DOS, because you only run one thing at a time, that was no problem. It was a mistake in the code, but you'd never experience bad side effects of that because DOS would not reclaim or use the memory until SimCity completely exited. But in Windows, Windows could reclaim the memory that was freed from SimCity, and somebody would be like, Windows is a piece of garbage. SimCity doesn't work. And there are a lot of issues like that are facing developers porting games from Windows to Linux. ID Software, John Carmack, those guys really early on were super big fans of gaming on Linux. I have an original 10 version of Quake for Linux that I bought way back. It was one of the first computer games that I ever bought in order to support game development on Linux, and it ran really well. But things on Linux have changed so much since then that you don't even really run that version anymore. Like, you can use some of the art assets from it, but everything else has been completely rewritten because Linux has changed 37 times since then. And we kind of have that now. The graphics subsystem in Linux is still in a constant state of flux and evolution. We have like the windowing system, we had X and then X386 and then Xorg, and now we're switching to something called Wayland, and Wayland isn't quite there yet. And that has nothing to do with like the actual 3D part of it. And Valve has invested a crazy amount of money in things like Proton and Vulkan to try to bring the gaming APIs.
We'll talk about that soon.
Okay. So it's an uphill battle for developers no matter what you do. Also, Linux users, they complain a lot. So like there was BioShock for Linux, and those guys I think are on record as saying, well, we did the Linux version of that, but oh boy howdy do those guys complain.
And that's actually a fair thing for them to bring up, because I think Linux users, there's that classic, there's literally dozens of us. Linux users, I think, sometimes underestimate or don't properly understand the for-profit software industry. When you're a game developer, you need an ROI on everything you queue up for a developer in Jira or whatever. That time costs you, and
yes,
you need money in return for it. And I think that's something that has made it easier for me to engage with you, because you actually run a business where you have developers and engineers, and you kind of understand that output must be greater than or equal to input.
Exactly.
Equation.
Yeah.
And so I think from a user standpoint, Linux users sometimes overestimate their own importance as a customer, having paid $30 whole for this game, and don't realize what a small market they are. And when we talk about that fragmentation, that's something that has hurt what I said I thought was the big problem for Linux, and that was gaming, because it's really hard for software developers to support Linux because of that fragmentation. Like you might be using the open source version of this graphics driver instead of the graphics card maker provided version, or you might have some dependency that you're missing, or whatever else the case may be. Supporting these users, even if you could just say, okay, let's compile the game for Linux, even if it was that simple, supporting these users to get the game installed and running is a whole additional challenge. And nowadays, gaming is so different than what it used to be. It used to be keyboard, mouse, maybe a gamepad, right? Gravis gamepad, huh? Am I right?
Yeah. I
All
had
right.
that.
Maybe that, okay, but now you've got game controllers, and for those, well, there's X input, or maybe you want to go wireless over Bluetooth with a PlayStation
Is it analog
controller.
or digital?
There's VR. Oh my God. I mean, what a nightmare, right? You've got these cameras that have to have these high speed, motion tracking systems running at all times. I mean, it's a whole ball of wax. And unless you have that critical mass, how do you get adoption? Now, there's a reason I brought up gaming before, and that I'm making it such a central part of my argument, because I think gaming is where Linux failed to reach the mainstream, And I also think that gaming is going to be the way that Linux ultimately captures the mainstream. It's bigger than ever. I mean, would you agree gaming is more diverse than ever before?
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, if you look around at all of the stuff that's coming down the pike and all the stuff that's available now,
Even the
there's
users. Like
there's
gaming is not just weird white guys with beards anymore. No offense, no offense.
no,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
and you know the consoles are basically just gaming PCs. You know, on the PC there's this enormous back catalog of amazing gaming experiences, and the PC gamer, the stereotypical one that goes, you know, why can't I run a community server? Why is it that when a game developer shuts down the server, I'm no longer able to matchmake with my friends? That's ridiculous. That is such a Linux attitude. You know, why
Yeah.
shouldn't I be able to do my own thing? And there's these novel new form factors. I want to talk about the Steam Deck.
Yes. The Steam Deck, the Steam Deck is a really interesting piece of technology because it really, there's a lot of things going on under the hood. One, Valve has switched from their Debian base, which is like the most stable distro, to Arch. It's like, yo, I'm running Arch BTW if you got the Steam console, which
Well,
is,
you hadn't mentioned it. You hadn't mentioned it. I've known you for a whole 30 seconds. You hadn't mentioned it yet. I'm surprised.
well, anybody that buys that is going to be able to say that because they really will be running Arch on their Steam handheld. Um, and Valve is investing a crazy amount of money in the software side of this. We're
Yeah.
not there today,
Talk to
but
me about Proton.
so I think eventually Proton is a kind of compatibility layer that a crazy amount of money and effort has been invested into to try to give Linux a comparable API to Windows. And some of the changes to be able to better support gaming on Linux actually reach all the way into the kernel. A couple of things have been added as primitives for programmers in the Linux kernel to make it easier to do a one-to-one port of a game to Linux so that you'll at least have comparable performance. Because if you could kind of emulate something Windows does in software, it's always going to be worse performance than something
Yeah.
you can get native. And so Valve and the developers that they're paying have done a really incredible job so far. We're not there yet, but I think that Steam is a big enough platform that, like the Apple Store, they can audit the things that you upload from a programming level and say, you're probably going to have problems if you try to do it this way. You should do it our sanctioned way here. You should do it our sanctioned way here. And cumulatively, they have all of that combined experience from all of these gaming houses, and they can pour all of that experience, hopefully as noble stewards of that kind of thing, into Linux in general. And then we'll have a little bit of fragmentation as the different distros choose to implement that different ways. But Valve at least is the 800-pound gorilla that can, sort of do what they need for the gaming side of things and get it done. It makes it more like Android. So like gaming on Linux, if you're gaming on Android, you're technically gaming on Linux. But the software layer and the driver layer and the graphics layer are all handled not just by Google, but also Samsung and other companies like that. So you've got a little bit of the 800-pound gorilla from a different $1 trillion company handling things there, and that's
And
really what brings us all together.
and here's something. You've got incentive. You know, we make the joke. There's literally dozens of us. Okay? When the Steam Deck is shipping in earnest, I have no doubt whatsoever from the kind of momentum that I've seen in our community, whenever we discuss it on our podcast or in the video where we got our hands on with it, Valve is going to sell literally millions of it.
I think so too.
And that is a game changer. I mean, Valve is a problematic company in some ways. I don't agree with everything that they do. I mean, they've had their fair share of controversies over the years. Whether you want to talk about, taking 30% of developers' fees to essentially, provide a download and DRM service. Whether you want to talk about the way that they've worked with the Chinese government to create a CCP-approved version of Steam. I definitely have issues with some of the things Valve has done over the years, but as stewards of a more open approach to gaming, it seems like whether you trust Valve or not, their motivations are at least aligned with that community to the point where I think that they are going to do a good job of creating these tools in a way that it benefits more than just Steam and the Steam Deck. I see this benefiting the Linux community in a way that will change the game entirely. You're going to have this incentive now for developers to reach that install base, the Steam Deck install base. Being able to put that badge next to your game in the marketing, now available on Xbox, PlayStation, Steam Deck. I think it's going to be that big of a thing. How much have people, like, what, we haven't had a good handheld. You can count the Switch. It's only sort of a handheld, though. We haven't had a good handheld since, what, the PS Vita? That's not
Yeah.
from Nintendo.
Yeah, that's so true. That is so true. There and other companies have been successful, like the GPD folks, but it's still pretty niche.
Oh, it's super niche. I mean, we're talking thousands of units, and most of them run Windows, Wendell.
Yeah, yeah, that's not super awesome. The other thing that's going to happen with this is the library of non-Steam games that'll also be available on Linux. So like all of the LucasArts games from like the 80s and 90s, those still hold up. You can play those. They're point and click adventures. They're great to play on the train or the morning commute or whatever.
Sure.
And that will work great on the new thing that Valve is working on. And those work great on Linux, the emulation and all the other stuff. It's going to be ready to go out of the box. And so you're going to have a really incredible gaming experience, not just for AAA stuff, not just for the latest and greatest, but it's going to open up all of that back catalog. And, you could do that on the Nintendo Switch, but Nintendo won't condone that. You can mod it, but nobody wants to do that because it's too much work and headache. I mean, the
Well,
niche will do it, but
they might brick your console. That's a whole separate
yeah.
conversation. So Valve has so far shown that they intend to keep the Steam Deck quite open. They will allow you to install Windows on it, or not, allow you. They won't specifically try to block you from installing Windows on it. You can plug it into a dock and just sit and use it as a desktop. To, open up a web browser, or, okay, maybe not video editing. There's not really a great Linux linear video editor just yet that I'm aware of. Otherwise, we would have tried it.
DaVinci Resolve is the leader right now, but for your workflow, you probably need more horsepower.
Yeah, it's not there yet. It's not there yet for us. But nothing would prevent you from firing up DaVinci Resolve on your Steam Deck and using it. So I see the Steam Deck as, I think some people could easily see it as another Android, but I don't. And the reason for that is that so far Valve is taking an open enough approach to it that I see the benefits being that this is going to be the first exposure people are going to have with Linux as a desktop operating system, because that's essentially what it is. The second they dock their Steam Deck, and they'll want to, maybe they want to watch Netflix on their TV or whatever, they just dock it, plug it, use the touch screen or use the joysticks to, use the mouse or whatever, open it up. They're going to be, oh my God, these are going to be people that are using Linux for the first time in their lives, and they're going to do it without even thinking about it. And they're going to be like, wow, that wasn't so bad.
I think that's probably true.
That is going to be a changing of the tide. That's the way that I see it. You're going to get developers wanting to target these users with these millions of units install base. You're going to get people actually trying it instead of just hearing about it from their nerdy friend with the bad body odor. And it's going to change the perception. It's going to all of a sudden seem kind of like just normal.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what set all this off was when Valve did some kind of a demo with Microsoft in the Windows 8 or Windows 10 era, and Microsoft was saying, we're going to try to move toward consoles. Like, we see you running a game on your Xbox console and streaming it back to Windows, and sort of Gabe at Valve was like, oh no, we can't have that. And 5 years later, thus was born things like Proton and DXVK. It seems like Valve has been funding those guys for a lot longer than anyone realizes, because it is a monumental, like, building that layer is a monumental software undertaking. And in the way that has not been beneficial for the community with Android, I think you're exactly right that is beneficial for the community on Linux, because it is much more accessible and not, quote unquote, inside Android.
Well, we've run out of time, unfortunately. I feel like we could have easily talked for another hour about this, but You know, just to be clear, even though I said gaming, I absolutely agree with you. Fragmentation. I know you and I have talked at length about that before. This was a ton of fun. Guys, if you enjoy these Facebook Live audio rooms, our next one is coming next week. It's going to be Should You Let Your Children Use Technology? It's going to be featuring a relatively new father. James, he's got a couple of kids under 4. And then we're going to have the one and only Brian the electrician joining us as well. I'll be, of course, contributing my couple of cents. But that's it for this one. We've got to sign off. So, Wendell, can you let people know where to find you? Facebook, Instagram, YouTube?
I'm on Facebook at facebook.com/level1techs and youtube.com/level1techs and on Twitter at TechWendell. I don't know. It's a lot of fun stuff, fun conversation. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a blast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. See you later, everyone.